Thanks everybody for being here. It's such a pleasure to have these very special women up with me tonight who are such titans in their fields. And I want to just start from the beginning to read an extract from this book that really, to me, sparked my imagination when I was learning about Frances Burke. Designer and businesswoman Frances Burke was a dynamic, feisty person, articulate with a resonant, commanding voice, distinctive enunciation, and a unique way of expressing herself. Her bright blue eyes focused directly on those around her. Diminutive in height, with her light blonde hair invariably styled in a French roll, she was always elegantly dressed and was excessively fond of hats. Burke had a zest for life and loved her chosen career. She was good company and a loyal friend. A friend of hers described her as extreme, but something of a legend. She didn't suffer fools gladly, but she mellowed. Another friend remembered her as a fascinating character who nevertheless could be difficult. Not a lot was readily disclosed. She kept a lot to herself, they said. Confident in the expression of her sexuality, Burke was wryly described by a friend as chic and almost out. A complex person with a strong drive to succeed, Burke was a catalyst for change and loved engaging with new ideas and cultivating new friends. Generous with her support of younger designers, she enjoyed communicating her passionate interests in design and the arts. So I just think that's so amazing to hear all of these elements of a person's life laid out in that way. And there are so many things, from her love of hats to her quiet queerdom, that I think is just fascinating. So I would just love to hear, perhaps from Robyn and Nanette, if you could give us a brief overview of the key kind of parts of her life, just to kickstart us off today.
Right. Well, she lived for 90 years, so it will be a brief overview. But around her 35th year, she made herself a SWOT exercise. She had by then attended the National Gallery School. She'd also attended RMIT. The gallery school, she did very classical drawing work. At RMIT, she learned how to print both lino and screen printing. And then she went to the George Bell School, where she learnt about colour. And she exploded all of those things together to decide that she wasn't ever going to be able to make a living as a painter. That we think she probably had been burnt when she was younger. Her father had left the household, and she was able to do all these artistic things, having already done nursing training, because her mother had died and left Frances and her two siblings a bequest. So she was able to use that to explore her more creative side, and then decided that she really wanted to be comfortable in life. And I think she sat down and did a SWOT exercise, what we would now know as a SWOT exercise, which we've pictured in the book so that you could read it in her handwriting, because it was an extraordinary exploration by a young woman who knew herself pretty well by that stage, and decided that in addition to her skills and talents, which she'd summed up, and her hope for the future, she also believed that art should be for everyone. And so it was a very egalitarian approach to how she would continue to play out her creative skills and talents. And she decided that textiles was a good way to go. And as you see from the pieces flashing in front of you, she really did a pretty good job. And the cover that we used on the book was a design that was available for 40 years. And really, the major English, you think of William Morris, Sanderson's, various others in that sort of era, are the ones that have lasted. But we don't have anyone in Australia and we have to say also that Burke preceded Marimekko, where a lot of people think that she was emulating it. She started her business way before Marimekko did. So she was extremely creative, insightful in her own, for herself, and she had a great deal of foresight in being able to stay on message, really, for the rest of her business life.
So Frances Burke was also a really interesting woman in that she not only promoted her work, but she promoted design to Australians. She was a founding member of the Society of Designers for Industry from 1947. She lectured about design to community groups. She was whenever in the post-war period from 1947, she started travelling annually and then every couple of years overseas, mostly to America, but also later to Europe. And she was always interviewed on her return by local newspapers. And so she would talk about design, what was the latest overseas, and bringing back ideas. And also she talked very much too about the home, and also about what was going to be convenient for women, about the sorts of things about the home. The things like, better cooking vessels, safer things. She was also interested in, how design could improve women's lives. So those were things that she talked about in newspapers and in her lectures. So she was kind of interested in moving beyond just as an advocate, not just as a practitioner. And
Robyn, you mentioned that SWOT analysis that she did. In the book, it's her 2-year plan. It's her 2-year plan for living is what she called it. It's just an extraordinary document, and it begins, it finishes with this plea: to whom it may concern, give me what I'm asking for, clear head, clear vision, clear discrimination that I shall not waste my time on inessentials, peace, happiness, security, stability and purpose, progression from year to year. Like you said, she had clearly has such a strong sense of who she is at that point, even though it's at the beginning, in effect, of her career. Where did that self-determination or that presence of self come from in her life, do you think?
Ooh. Was it genetic? Was it inherited? Was it learnt? Who knows, actually. But I met Frances at various stages in her life, and I have to say that even at the end, when I was interviewing her for my master's in the early 1990s, you could have ticked all those boxes. She really did amazingly. She was still pretty steady and with a very good memory, as long as Phoebe, her devoted companion of 67 years, was in the room and could shine the torchlight onto the piece that we were talking about. And Frances could recall in minute detail. So she enjoyed her life enormously, and she did live with the love of Phoebe and the support of Phoebe. I would love to have had a wife like Phoebe. It would have been fabulous. But Frances was out there building the business and enjoying her life, which sometimes included Phoebe. But they really came to a very balanced and terrific... it was a partnership. Phoebe worked in the business from time to time too. But as a plan for living, it extended way beyond 2 years. It was the next 50.
And, you mentioned that she was obviously a highly trained artist. She'd gone through a number of different art schools. Early on was a painter, indeed. But she'd made a clear decision to be a designer, a commercial designer, instead of an artist. Why did she make that decision?
Well, that was the more than goodwill, wasn't it? She wanted people to be able to own a piece of design, something that was beautifully designed, that was a component of their rooms and would give them great pleasure in their living spaces. So as Nanette mentioned, she was concerned with the way the houses were designed. So she worked with a lot of architects and interior designers. She set up a retail shop that could show people how the furniture of Grant Featherston or Clement Meadmore and others partnered with her fabrics. And she retained a very useful and clear, lively idiom for her designs right through to the end. I've forgotten the question, Dewi.
Why did she make the decision to focus on commercial design?
Because she wanted people to own a piece of something that was attainable for them and gave them great pleasure, where if they were going to buy a painting, they needed to be fairly cashed up. But she thought that in the post-war period, with the new houses being designed, the new spaces, the light-filled, and this is one of them, and here's furniture and the fabric shown together that came from her studio. So she, and also in this next one, the coloured chart on the other side is owned by the NGA and is one of 3 panels that she developed to show people what colours they could choose their fabrics in, and she would then advise them on the amount of fabric to be used in the room so that it wasn't overwhelming, so that it was a unit of colour and design within a room. And she was very clear that the balance needed to be right.
Yeah, and
she was pretty forthright too. So
I'm sure she had opinions.
She would have been difficult to have disagreed with, I think.
We'll talk about some of that love of colour and her feelings on colour later, but I want to go back to that idea of her decision around commercial design versus art. And I know that, Beci, this is something that we've talked about as well, that you're pretty clear on that distinction for yourself, that you consider yourself a designer and not an artist. What does that distinction mean to you?
I feel like I don't actually fit into either category, but if I fit into one of them, it would definitely be a designer. I feel like, for me, like, people call me an artist, I'm saying, my work is too commercial, it has too much commercial context, and in general I produce work for other people, whereas I feel like a lot of artists produce work for themselves and for other people to enjoy it, but primarily I'm having someone tell me what to do, and I really love that, and it gets to be enjoyed by a whole lot of people in a lot of different situations, which art does too, but mine is like definitely a commercial context. So yeah, I always say I'm definitely a designer more than an artist because of that. Yeah, and I guess in the same vein, that kind of what I do, people can enjoy in their homes, or it could be in Maya, or it could be in the Bookshop, or it could be a whole lot of different places rather than just a gallery.
I get the impression that Frances, nobody ever told her what to do, and I don't know how she would have accepted it, but excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. But in the book, she's quoted as saying that some of her friends, her art friends from art school days, would joke that she was a monster of commerce, and it struck me that there seems to be, in a lot of kind of conversations around art and design, that there's some inherent negativity to being commercial, and it makes me wonder, is that necessarily a bad thing? She made a career out of it. Beci, you're making a career out of it. Is there something that you think you have to fight against when you're considered commercial?
Definitely. As far as, I've applied for a few grants, but because I don't fit into like an artist category, it's really hard for people to define what I do, and because I do have that commercial context to my work, I feel like that's potentially off-putting for sort of art-based things. So I definitely think there is, and there's a lot of people who I work with in a similar category to me, where you're not quite, like, I'm not technical enough to be a designer, but I'm not, I don't know, cerebral, I guess, enough to be considered an artist. So yeah, definitely there is a negative context in that commercial way, which I can understand, that makes sense, but the same, I still go through a similar thought process, or I still go through the creativity is potentially still the same, but just the way that it's expressed or the way that it's used in the end is actually quite different. So yeah, I think that's super interesting actually, that the process can be completely the same, but the way that the outcome is viewed is quite different. Yeah.
Did you ever, through your research, Robyn or Nanette, get a sense that she rued that she wasn't considered an artist, or that she had, made such a departure away from her roots?
Absolutely not.
No, I don't think so. She. It was interesting when that Monster of Commerce comment was made, was 1952, and actually around sort of 1950 to 1954 was the absolute heyday of the when we were literally counting up, press references in magazines and newspapers, our folders, and we were filing, the results of our findings. The 1950 to 54 folder, we have to lift it with two hands, whereas the other folder,
we divided it.
We divided it, and then it kept getting fatter and fatter. So clearly, that was the absolute high point when she was getting a lot of press. There's pretty much no Australian Home Beautiful, it doesn't either have her work in an advertisement, a feature article, or has an advertisement for her. So there were, she was really doing well at that point, and I think that's when the kind of perhaps a little green monster turned up for these artists who perhaps weren't doing as well.
We also have to note there that we're indebted to Trove. For any of you who may be researchers or who are vaguely interested in finding out more through magazines and newspapers, Trove has been extraordinary. When I did my master's, I did it through interviewing Frances and her sort of cohort, which was really interesting, and I'm super glad I did it because they're no longer around. But then being able to go into Trove was magic, and we both worked together sitting in front of the computer. So when we were actually researching and looking at Trove, it was like, oh my God, look at this. It was really cool.
I know in the book you sort of write as well about she did a stint in advertising for a brief moment. Yeah. But that she almost created a brand strategy before we had the term for brand strategy. She's done a 2-year plan before perhaps like manifesting became a kind of a concept or an idea that anybody really worked with. And it just struck me that she was so successful. Like, do you have to have a strategy to be successful, do you think, in design? I mean, Beci, do you have a 2-year plan or a
50-year plan?
50-year plan?
Absolutely not. My whole career has been incredibly organic. I definitely have thoughts in my head. I'm like, I'd really like to work for that person. Definitely you intuitively work towards those goals, but I've never written anything down. I'm really scared to commit to things, everyone's scared of failure,
isn't it?
I think, whereas I guess my husband runs a business as well, and he's like, we talk about like it's the same thing with like budgeting. Like, you've got to put this budget in so you can see if you can meet it. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm too scared to do that. I'm too scared of the rejection of not actually achieving it. But he's like, well, it's not about that. But no, I've never done that. My career's been very organic. Potentially I've written lists in my head, but not. Yeah, I think it's amazing.
That's what she did. She emptied the contents of her head,
maybe I should
onto paper, and it was in fact serendipitous that I came across that. It was long before Nanette and I got together. I'd been interviewing Frances, and while I'd been interviewing her, Fabi had been cleaning out the studio and throwing away all her business records because she didn't consider that the financials of the business were anyone else's concern or business. And yet at the same time she had a great commitment to Frances being well known, and gave me $100,000 to support the project which I'd originated with my supervisor and head of department, Professor Janet Mead, to start the Australian Centre for Fashion and Textile Design, which became one of the building blocks of the fantastic RMIT Design Archive. And Fabi was busy throwing all these things away, so we really had to work hard to find what Frances less altruistic sort of focus was.
Yeah.
Whether she really had a business plan or not, we don't know.
Yeah, but the thing that we did find is that she was clearly agile, and then, the interviews often gave away what was going on in her life and her mind and her business. And so, for example, after the war, a lot of the tariffs that had been set up in the 1930s and for the Depression were dropped, and of course it made local production more expensive, and also because the war was over, so all these new goods were coming in from America, from Japan and other countries, and she and other producers, quite a lot of businesses, of course, went out of business. But she had to sort of change what she was doing, and she quickly, developed new. That's when she set up her own retail, because she had production she had to get rid of. So she set up a shop and started selling it herself. And then when she did that, it was really successful. And she said, "I wish I'd done it years ago." And then later on, she came up with other strategies about how to. We noticed a kind of drop in her production in 1958, and in terms of how she's being represented, and then she came up with a new strategy to sell her fabrics under a sort of sub-brand. So, she was really interesting in the way she did that.
Yeah, her business savvy is really clear, right? Like even the fact that she was constantly moving studios. She went from like Hardware Lane to Little Collins Street.
Hardware Lane was the longest.
Yeah. And I think you wrote that it's because she was looking for the cheapest rents all the time, so she was never wanting to lock herself into expensive real estate.
She also, in a couple of moves, when she went in with Stanley Coe and some of the others, she was looking at partner exhibitors, partner retailers that could enhance the fabrics, and that the fabrics could enhance for their businesses. So she always had an eye out to the way they were going to sit. She was under no illusions that the fabrics were the most important things, but they were an important unit, and she was strong on the unit thing. So she sort of... She was being agile and pivoting, dare we say, in the marketplace before anybody would have really picked a PR or a marketing strategy per se. I'm not sure that she would have written that down, but she clearly had in her head the way she wanted to approach the market.
Yeah, and I mean, now that we're moving into a conversation about the fabrics, let's start talking, I suppose, about her designs, which we've been, seeing flash up, not these exact slides, but have been seeing them flash up behind us. In the early phases of her career, she clearly lent towards flora. She celebrated Australian natural flora as well. And I guess what strikes me is that she's trying to convey movement and complexity of the natural world, but she's doing it in a very 2D way. And I'm just interested, Beci, from your point of view, in a technical, like what sort of technical challenge is that from a designer's, through a designer's eye to achieve what she's done?
Yeah, I think especially coming from an art background where you've got like every colour and lots of different mediums and things like that, and also coming from a pre-computer era to actually have the skills to go from something like an oil painting to then like a one colour, quite bold design is like quite a huge step and quite a big process. And at that stage, it's a really bold kind of thing to do. Obviously you need to have really good drawing skills, and she had obviously developed those drawing skills, but technically it's much harder to produce a design that's one colour or two colour than 35 colours, for example. So the skill that's required to actually reduce into these, designs that were quite refined is there's a lot of technical skill, and that you need to have that, especially pre-computer. Now you can do it in a few clicks of a button.
But actually her first attempts were very difficult for her, weren't they? Her first attempt she found quite hard to make that transition.
Yes. She she had learnt, as we mentioned, lino printing and then screen printing at RMIT. The lino printing, she was working with Napier Waller, we believe, at RMIT, and there was also a man, Michael O'Connell, who was using huge lino blocks to produce fabulous designs as well. She had less luck in the very beginning, but she persevered, and still, probably the actual design, she was getting her head around the printing, the technical printing act, and also the dye chemistry. Once she got that nailed, she seemed to be much freer in her designs, and she could work further to pare them back to come up with the really simple shapes. Because if you look at the first 3 or 4 years of her business, and the NGA's got some very fine examples of lino blocks on linen, they were probably fussier, a bit smaller, but then she grew into her idiom, and she was able to take the designs and really, as Becky said, pare them back right down until they were pleasing. She also had, as you see in the middle there, she had various techniques that she used, and some of them look like block prints, but there's 4 or 5 different motives that she might have used or whatever. So she had a sort of an approach, but depending on the commission or the outcome as well, she was able to use them in different ways, present them in different ways. The colours were especially important to her.
She became quite well known for a sort of a body of work that drew on Indigenous and Pacific art from PNG, from I guess Tahiti as well. I think it was probably of that time as well. But I'm interested really in how do we reconcile what in modern terms would be called cultural appropriation with the within a decades-long career that had several hundreds or thousands of different kinds of designs. How do we sit with that, and was that ever considered kind of controversial that she drew on those influences?
Well, she was her first entree into textile design was an interview with Pierre Fornari, who was the fashion director at George's department store. And he had been interviewed in the Herald saying that why don't Australian designers look to Indigenous design for inspiration? And she went in and showed him drawings of things that she'd seen in the Melbourne Museum. Of course, there's a really good collection since the 1920s of Indigenous culture, and there's also, Pacific Islands and New Guinea pieces as well. So that was a kind of starting point. The interesting thing is that it took till sort of 1940, before, so another 3 years before we see that Indigenous influences in her work, and that corresponds with World War II and the sort of growth of sort of nationalism, and that sort of increased. So I think at the time, and particularly at that point. And the other thing is with the Pacific, in the 1920s, a few, wealthy people would go on cruises to Pacific Islands, but in the 1930s, there was the Orient Line and the White Star Line, which was Japanese, starting up cruises for middle-class people. And there's this whole sort of changeover of Australians sort of looking to the Pacific. Also, from around the 1920s, 1921, Australia became was given by the League of after World War II New Guinea as a territory, and they've been also administering Papua since the early part of even earlier in the century. So Australia was kind of, in a sense, had this sort of colonial role and was taking over certainly Papua New Guinea, and seen as a kind of elder in the burgeoning area of the Pacific. And also the other thing was that Australians were investing there and getting rich. So there's this sense that this was a kind of source of wealth and interest, and the magazines of the time, the Home magazine, for example, and also the Burns Filth magazine, were really promoting the idea of going on Pacific cruises, going to the Pacific, seeing what was there, investing and so on. So it was this whole sort of change of focus. Before that, very much the focus is back to England, to the mother country, to Europe, and there's a sort of more opening up to the Pacific and a bit across to America as well, which of course was once the Second World War and after 1942, when the Americans came in, that was increased as well. So that sort of Pacific interest in Frances Burke was part of an overall interest in Australia about the Pacific from the 30s. But yeah, the Indigenous part comes in sort of into the war, and whether it was clearly nowadays it would be totally unacceptable, her use of Indigenous motifs, and she was never questioned, or as far as we know, and there's no interviews, she didn't talk about what she was doing and so on. There was some comeback though. At the same from 1952, Bill Onus, an Aboriginal man who came from Cummeragunja in southern New South Wales, he had come to Melbourne in the much earlier in the 40s, and was an activist, was working as a dock worker, and then he set up a business called Aboriginal Enterprises, which had a shop in Belgrave, and he made things for the shop. He commissioned other Aboriginal people to produce things, and he commissioned a woman to screen print designs of fabrics, which he sold from the shop, but also they were sold through Patterson's furniture store. And he was interviewed from time to time, and there's a couple of interviews where he said, that Australians are getting used to having Aboriginal motifs and symbols and so on, and he didn't see anything wrong with that, but he said, but they're not genuine. What we produce in our store is genuine. It's the real thing. And so he said that over a few years in a number of fora. So I think that was really interesting that he was kind of having his say about that, but not naming names. He wouldn't say Frances Burke or Margaret Preston or so on. Yeah.
And I mean, we're thinking about that post-war period as well. Frances, it seems like she just set out and just started travelling. She went to the US and Europe for huge stretches of time. I think one of her journeys was 5 months or something like that. So what was she seeing overseas that she was then drawing on and being inspired by and bringing back to Australia?
One of the things that blew us away a bit was in Chicago, the Merchandise Mart, which was this vast building that was something like 6 blocks of Chicago mid-city, and about 10 stories, I think, wasn't it? Or 12 stories or something.
It had a TV studio so that they could make TV programs about the merchandise in it.
And it was a permanent trade fair sort of / expo that she visited. She went to a lot of those sorts of exhibitions, fairs, etc. And she appears to have been able to have sifted what she saw pretty quickly. Having done many trade fairs myself, both as an exhibitor and as a visitor, they're quite overwhelming. There's so much stuff and there's so many people. And when you think of the Chicago Merchandise Mart, she whisked through it and was able to write a really interesting diary entry for it, which the NGV's got. And she was able to then condense that and bring it home. And when she was interviewed by the various magazines or newspapers, she was able to put it together in a very clear way. So she was influenced by them, and she, as Nanette mentioned earlier, she also was very concerned that women should have kettles with wooden, not metal handles. And
spring-loaded clothes pegs.
Yes, things that would make life just that little bit easier. So she always had an eye out to the things that would work. After she'd established her retail outlet, she had an eye out to what would work in the outlet. But prior to that, she'd been travelling for a fair while. She travelled as soon as you were able to fly. She wasn't interested in going on ships, though there was a lot of cruises, it said. She was much more interested in popping on a plane and arriving quickly, and being able to really bring back what was good.
And also museums. She actually made a trip to Toronto, especially because apparently they have a very good Chinese collection in their museum. So she was interested, in ethnographic collections wherever she went.
Am I right in remembering that her approach to the use of print and colour changed as well after some of her trips to the States? So she came back and decided to... I might be going off script here, but I feel like you would know, and if you're not showing recognition, then that clearly means that it didn't happen. But I thought there was a moment where she came back and decided that she would start investing in bolder colours rather than prints and colours.
Did we write that?
All right.
I don't remember writing.
Well, I'll refer you to the page if I can ever find it. But on that awkward segue into the idea of colour, there are some sort of passages that just really blow me away, and one of them was the interiors that she did for the Arrow Theatre, which was in East Melbourne?
No,
Middle Park.
Middle Park, that's right. And she did the interiors for this new... I guess it was meant to be quite kind of contemporary theatre that was going to change the face of the theatre scene in Melbourne. The foyer had lavender blue, pale grey and chartreuse. And then the auditorium had a wall of shocking pink contrasts and navy and blue curtains. And I just... as a colour fiend, that just is so exciting to me because you just can't imagine that in a contemporary theatre. But... what did colour mean to her, and how did she use it through her
One of her marvellous quotes was that colour was a living, joyous thing, which really sums up how she felt about it and how she approached using the colours. The other thing that we forgot when we were talking about her business was that she also said that during the war there was nothing so satisfying for a business person than to have a monopoly, which is a vast understatement. Because if you have a monopoly, as she did, it meant that she could really... she could bend the market. She created the market, and then she could bend it to her own pleasure, really. And we have to say that in the colour thing is also the joyous word. And I'm sure she had her hard times. She no doubt did, as we know some of them were pretty low. But overall, she had a very joyous approach to life, which she still had when she was nearly 90. She was... she kept up that sort of... It wasn't ridiculously upbeat or anything because she was so grounded in terms of her financial and business and marketing skills, but overall was this joyous colour that she really did adhere to. It was terrific.
Yeah, she said it vibrates. That was part of that quote as well.
Yes.
And, I mean, Beci, you went to RMIT. You were the young design student that came across Frances Burke when you were there as well.
Yeah.
Colour is such a big part of your practice.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think Frances's work became really important. I was there when you acquired the collection, I think. And it was like a big buzz in the textile design department, especially. So, yeah, I mean, I think definitely we're looking at a lot of Frances's work, and definitely I see a lot of similarities with my own work, with the sort of the pared back and sort of the uses of colour is really important to me as well. And I think what she said about it being joyous and also vibrating is absolutely spot on in terms of my work as well. But yeah, she was definitely influential, and the fact that she was a woman, the fact that she ran her own business was all like things that even in the 90s when I was studying was still not a hard concept to grasp, but it was still like a big deal. So I think in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s it was a very big deal. So yeah, she was very influential. Yeah.
And she was sort of interested in the psychological effects of colour. I know it's a sort of discredited kind of part of psychology now, but when she was designing for hospitals, she sort of thought really carefully about that. But were there colours that made her feel certain ways? Did you ever come across anything like that? Or Beci, is there a colour that makes you feel a certain way, happy?
Yeah, there's
or
definitely a blue. There's definitely a sort of sagey, greeny, acre pale blue that's really nostalgic for me. Yeah, and I think definitely Frances uses it in her work, and yeah, it's just a colour I come back to all the time. And yellow. Yeah. I don't know about feelings, but they're just like nostalgic colours for me that I use time and time again. I can't escape them. I'll be like, I'm not going to use that colour, and then it pops up again. Yeah.
She didn't have a dominant palette though for herself. She used everything.
I think it was still quite subdued. Like, it's still like they weren't like... I think she did have a palette. You could still do a Frances Burke palette, I think.
Well, the 3 panels that the NGA's got show a fabulous colour range, really good. But interestingly also, when I was interviewing them latterly in their lives, colour wasn't very evident in their home or in what they wore. They were fairly subdued. But clearly she had so much pleasure out of this is her workroom and retail space. Such a pity that the right hand one at least wasn't in colour, because they were all high toned colours. You'll have to have a look at the book. but she did relish and knew also the architects that she worked with on commission were Roy Grants and Robyn Boyd and Guildford Bell and yes, various others. She was careful with her colour palette, and they were the commissions were in conjunction with the architects, not that they drove the design or requested the colours, but they understood that what Frances would deliver to them was going to be just right. These are obviously hospital rooms, so she would produce something that was a bit lower key and gentle. But there's one picture on this one. Sorry, I'm just looking at the monitor here, which is different to what's coming up on there fractionally. But there's a piece that she did for the Civic Centre, the Canberra Civic Centre Theatre. That was one of the last pieces she did, called Black Opal, which was just absolutely pulsating. And that was 2 years before she closed the business. So she was really, she really stayed on the colour thing. It was excellent.
It sort of takes me into the next, I think, phase then, is that idea that of her ubiquity. She was just everywhere for a long time. She was in people's homes, she was in hospitals, she was in theatres, designing the proscenium arch at the Canberra Theatre. She designed some things for miners' cottages.
Your lawn.
Yeah,
yes.
Your lawn and at Eildon as well, right? And so there's a sense of overexposure, and yet she somehow stayed relevant, which I'm really interested in. Like, how does she manage to do that?
Are you talking about me or her?
You talk about her, Dale.
How she stayed relevant, I think she just kept making work, right? Like, she just kept producing work, and I think that's what you've just got to do as a designer. You just keep making new work, and I think she was just really in tune with trends and what people want. And
I think she had a good radar, didn't she?
Yeah, amazing radar.
Yeah.
Of like... Yeah, but I think it was intuition as well. I think there's definitely a part of intuition that she had. And
look at those bright eyes. And the hat. As we said, she loved hats.
One of the things that's interesting in her really late work in the 60s, that Black Opal that Robyn was talking about, is quite textured. It has a sort of textured feeling, and that's quite a breakaway from her earlier work. And there's also the Shields design, which there's a pieces in the National Gallery of Victoria and National Gallery in Canberra, and that was designed specifically for the La Trobe Library at the State Library of Victoria, and that's got a strong texture through it. So she was sort of moving towards that 60s and really large motifs and textures, and we both feel like, you know, it would have been nice if she could have kept going with that, because it really, those designs are really gobstopping amazing designs, and I'm sure that they would be quite easily sell today. They're really interesting. Well, there's not that many of them.
Interestingly, about 10 minutes before we started this, I had a message from Virginia Rigney, who's the curator at the Canberra Museum and Gallery, with a photograph that shows Frances Black Opal, which will come later in this series of photos, which has been adapted for carpet in the theatre, which we had a fit about originally because we thought it was going to look like a pub. But in fact, they've done it very faithfully. And because the design is quite textural, the texture of the carpet seems to work. Simran, you can tell us when you've had a little visit to it.
I haven't seen it yet, but I will go with that.
Yes. It was... so she... It's interesting that it would have worked, the design, but it seems that it has, and she goes on being relevant. That's only just been installed.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, you know, you talked about her pivoting and the way she would see opportunity. I mean, she did that as well with some of her designs. She sort of repackaged a set of classics or something like that they were called. And it makes me wonder, like, as a designer, is it important to be able to be adaptable and to sort of shift as trends shift, or is it important to sort of stand your ground and be known for what you're known for? Like, Beci, do you have a view on that?
I think you can do both. Yeah. I think you can have a style, which she definitely did, but you can still evolve with that style. So I still think people would come to her for her style, but it's the current version of her style. And I think you need to be adaptable, but you still need to have, you know, a thing that people come to you for, but that can absolutely evolve into many different forms. So, and she was really, she was very good at that. I mean, most successful designers, that's the trick, I guess, of developing your own style, but it's flexible.
And also over a period, for example, with that design tiger stripe that she's developed in about 1938 and was still producing it in around 1968-69, she changed the colours over time. There were certain colours that you see in certain periods, and towards the end they started getting brighter and, you know, to a certain extent, and really intense. So I think that's another way she updated her. She kept some of her classic designs and was able to change the colours so that they fitted in with the sort of contemporary tastes.
And so, if we can talk about just the end of her life, because we'll have time for questions, I hope, if people would like to stay. But, you know, Robyn, you got the chance to interview her. Was she able to reflect on the legacy of her career? Was she able to sort of look back and see where she sat within sort of the design canon in Australia?
Yeah, she was under no illusions about that. She knew that she had contributed, but rather than sort of doing a bit of a chest thumping thing, she was quietly pleased that she'd been able to. She could see on one hand that she had been extremely influential, but it gave her great pleasure. So she wasn't. She was reflective, which was really, really good. She was very. She was still very specific about the things she said, and I think it was so interesting that by the end of her life she could tick almost every single box in her 2-year plan for living. That she had absolutely remarkable vision, and she didn't stray far from her plan, And yet I'm sure it wasn't, she didn't think, oh my God, I've got a plan, I've got to stick to it. She just did, because she did know herself well. But it gave her a great deal of pleasure. And after she'd retired from textile design, and in the period of her business, she'd gone on drawing and painting anyway, and she then did quite a lot more of it, was involved in the establishment of the Print Council, and she took a more important role with the DIA, although she had been one of the instigators of the Design Institute of Australia. There were 4 men and Frances at the first meeting. But then she also was involved in the Craft Council, which is where I first met her when I was 18. So,
and there was also the Museum of Modern Art and Design in Melbourne,
yes,
in the 1950s, started
with Georges
by
Mora.
Georges Mora.
John Reed.
John Reed from Heidi, and they also, she was the one that said it can't just be the Museum of Modern Art, has to have design in the title. We have to have design exhibitions.
And they said,
as well.
oh, okay.
Well, you couldn't say no to Frances, I don't think.
And so what's next for the sort of legacy of Frances Burke and the work that you're both doing?
Well, MUP are delightfully interested in another book, which may happen.
Seems like an opportunity for Uro there.
Thank you, Matt. But also, in the award of the Redmond Barry Fellowship, we were so delighted and so excited. It was multifaceted research award supported by both the State Library of Victoria and the University of Melbourne, which gave us $20,000. It gave us an office just in one of the sets of doors from the dome in the State Library, and the more organised support of the collections managers from both institutions. And we were so chuffed that we would like to establish an award in Frances' name. We have yet to determine who might partner with the State Library and whether it will in fact be a one-off or yearly or every 2 years. But that's the next sort of goal, to establish that and to be able to give somebody else that the excitement of being supported in an award like that. So we've got a bit of work to do.
That sounds super exciting. Really hope that comes off the ground, and I'm sure that lots of people will be watching that with enormous interest. So I just wanted to throw the floor open. If anybody would like to ask questions, now's your chance to ask 3 extraordinary experts in their fields, anything about Frances Burke or about design in general.
People are so good at asking questions, aren't they? Bonnie.
How old was Frances when she completed her last print or commercial album?
God, that's going to take maths, Bonnie. Yeah, well, the State Library was probably, in truth, the last one, but they were around about... Yes.
So that was 1967. And she wouldn't have been involved in the printing at that stage.
So she was 63.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is younger than we are now. So, yeah, she did. She kept going with an amount of energy that was pretty astonishing. Katie Somerville, have you got a dazzling question, Dal?
Pressure. Well, I'm curious, when you're doing your research, obviously you mentioned a couple of state collections or national collections that have holdings. Did you, along the way, discover that there are, treasures that people have held on to, or sort of private? I know, this is an era or a sort of period in terms of decorative arts and design that is getting more interest and attention more broadly in a whole new generation. Are there a whole lot of new people interested in her work?
Indeed there are. If Such a curated question, Katie. Indeed, thank you. Yes, if you look at Instagram and the number of people who post about modern objects of all sorts, and also the Modernistas foresight, who are Osmodern on Instagram, and also Modernista Mister, have been putting together auctions of modernist work, and they asked us last year if they could auction a book, which they have got heaps of, so yes, of course you can. But could we have a piece of fabric? Oh no. And then we rethought, and the fabric was hotly contended, because each time we've talked, which has been a number of times now, people have come out of the woodwork with really lovely pieces, some of which we're going to show the NGV. So, yes, there are definitely, there's a huge groundswell of interest, but it has been going on for a while in terms of modernist design, hasn't it, as you'd know?
I've got a question. What happened to Frances's work, like that huge 5 decades of work? Can you buy a Frances Burke reprint in fabric? Is it
no?
Anybody own the IP anymore?
Yes, RMIT own the copyright, and we've looked at doing. Well, in fact, when I was working with the head of department to set up the textile centre. We thought that we should be doing something with it, but we hadn't secured the copyright because we thought that people needed to be able to have access to it. That since has been secured. But
well, at this point, RMIT seem to be happy to allow people to, use her work in publications and so on, and under copyright
and carpet.
And so this is one, but this is the first time that for quite a while that anybody's used a Frances Burke design for an outcome, but it's not a commercial. As far as we know, that carpet is just for this one specific space, and it's not available commercially. But it may be, I don't know, perhaps.
Interestingly, that since we established the Textile Centre and the NGA and the NGV and the Powerhouse and Sydney Living Museums and Ararat Gallery have all acquired collections of Frances' work. I can't remember where I was going with that.
Well, there's...
Oh, the Florence Broadhurst piece, that's what I was going to... In the meantime, all those pieces have been busily going into galleries where the Florence Broadhurst franchise holders have set up an extraordinary collection of Florence Broadhurst designs which have been applied to everything you can think of. And perhaps we should have done that with Frances Burke. Given that the National Gallery of Australia has 180-something pieces, it would seem that we probably should have, because definitely Florence Broadhurst isn't represented in gallery collections in nearly those sorts of numbers. So Frances really did have the focus for modernist design that was a lasting contribution.
And it sounds like she might have quite liked it as well, to be in everyone's
She would have
homes
loved
in some way or shape or form.
She would have liked to have been here speaking for herself, in truth, probably. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and thank you so much to our panellists. It's been a real pleasure and an honour. Thank you. Bye.